Why I'm not a Democrat. There's a specific kind of pressure that comes with certain identities in this country. If you're a certain race, a certain class, a certain age, there's an assumption baked into a lot of conversations about which party you're supposed to belong to. Not which party do you support, but which party do you belong to. I want to talk about why I don't belong to one of them. Not because the other one's better. I'm not here to make that case either, but because I think the assumption itself deserves pushback, and I think the party gets away with a lot precisely because that pressure exists. Point one, the pressure itself. Before I get into the substance, I want to name the thing that makes this video necessary in the first place. There's an expectation, and especially if you grew up in certain communities, certain families, certain zip codes, that your politics are already decided for you. Not persuaded, decided. And when you push back on that, the response isn't usually, here's why I disagree with your reasoning. It's some version of, why would you side with them? That's not a party platform. That's tribal maintenance. And I think it's worth separating from the actual question of whether the party's positions and behavior hold up. Point two, career politicians running on grievance. Here's where I start getting into the substance. A lot of Democratic politicians have built entire careers on identifying real, legitimate grievances and then doing very little to actually resolve them. The grievance becomes the product. It gets talked about, campaigned on, fundraised off of, cycle after cycle, without ever quite closing the loop into a solution that would, frankly, put them out of a job. Take the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. It was written in direct response to Floyd's murder in 2020 with some of the party's most prominent black lawmakers, Karen Bass, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, as its face. It passed the House twice. Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency by 2021, and the bill still died. Negotiations collapsed in September 2021, with both sides blaming the other over qualified immunity. 3 years later, after another high-profile police killing, Democratic officials were still calling for the same bill to be revived. The issue stayed a rallying point through 2 more election cycles. The bill never became law. This isn't a claim that the grievances aren't real. It's a claim about incentives, that a politician whose career depends on a problem staying visible has a weaker incentive to actually fix it than we'd like to believe. Point three, stereotypes aren't a Republican monopoly. We talk a lot about the right's reliance on stereotypes and that criticism is often fair, but Democrats do the exact same thing, just aimed at different targets and dressed in different language. Think back to 2016, when Hillary Clinton described roughly half of Trump's supporters as belonging to a basket of deplorables, a phrase that instantly became shorthand for how a lot of Democratic messaging treats entire regions and classes of voters as a monolith to be diagnosed rather than persuaded. Working class white voters, rural voters, evangelical voters, these groups get flattened into a stereotype just as reliably as the groups Republicans flatten. If stereotyping is a problem when Republicans do it, it's a problem full stop. It doesn't become analysis just because it's coming from people who claim to be more enlightened about identity. Point four, the donor pivot. This is the point I think matters most, so I want to spend real time on it. Democrats present themselves, genuinely I think in a lot of cases, as the party of the working class. And on paper, a lot of their stated priorities back that up. But when actual legislation gets written, when actual money gets allocated, there's a pattern. When the interests of working people and the interests of major donors diverge, the party tends to find a way to serve the donors while keeping the working class rhetoric intact. Start with the Affordable Care Act in 2009. Obama and Democrats had a public option on the table, a government-run insurance plan that would compete with private insurers and, in theory, keep them honest on price. It passed the House. In the Senate, one Democratic caucusing Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, a state whose economy runs heavily on insurance companies, refused to support it, and without his vote, there was no path to 60. The industry had spent years cultivating that relationship. The public option was stripped out. The final bill, whatever good it did, left the insurance industry's business model fully intact. More recently, in 2021, as part of Build Back Better, Democrats tried to let Medicare negotiate drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies, something like 90% of the public supports across party lines. Three Democrats on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Kurt Schrader, Scott Peters, and Kathleen Rice, voted against their own party's bill and sank it in committee. The pharmaceutical industry had spent tens of millions on lobbying that year and had directed campaign contributions specifically at the Democrats it needed to peel off. One of those three received thousands of dollars from pharmaceutical executives within days of casting that vote. A weaker version eventually passed as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, but the original, more aggressive version never survived contact with the party's own members. I want to be careful here because this is the kind of claim that gets waved away as both sides-ism if I don't back it up. So I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm going to show you the paper trail. There isn't a major party in this country that consistently prioritizes working people over the donor class when the two are actually in conflict. Democrats aren't uniquely guilty of this, but they are the party that claims the moral high ground on it, which makes the gap between claim and behavior worth pointing out. Point 5. Slogans without delivery related to the above, but distinct enough to name on its own. Democratic campaigns run on language that sounds like commitment but functions like branding. Fight for $15 was one of the defining labor slogans of the last decade, and Democrats, including Biden himself, ran on it repeatedly. In 2021, when Democrats controlled the House, Senate, and White House, they tried to include a $15 federal minimum wage in the American Rescue Plan. The Senate parliamentarian ruled it didn't qualify for the fast-track process being used to pass the bill. Democrats could have overruled her. The vice president technically had that authority, but chose not to. Then, when Bernie Sanders forced a vote on the wage hike anyway, 8 Democratic senators joined every Republican in voting it down. The slogan didn't die, the policy did. A slogan isn't a policy. Repeating it louder isn't a substitute for passing it. Point 6. Status quo, when power is on the line. Here's the pattern that ties a lot of this together. When Democratic power or position is genuinely threatened internally or externally, the party's instinct is almost always to protect the status quo rather than risk the disruption that real change would require. Look at what happened in the 2020 primary once Bernie Sanders started actually winning. After Biden's win in South Carolina and in the single day before Super Tuesday, several of his moderate rivals, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, dropped out of the race and endorsed him in what was widely reported as a coordinated move by party figures worried Sanders couldn't beat Trump. Barack Obama reportedly worked behind the scenes to help consolidate that support. It wasn't a conspiracy in the cartoonish sense. It was the party's establishment doing exactly what establishments do when a candidate they see as too disruptive gets close to winning, closing ranks to protect the status quo. I think this is the most honest way to describe the party's character. Not malicious, not uniquely corrupt, just fundamentally risk-averse when its own position is what's on the table. Point 7. The honest ledger. I don't think this adds up to Democrats are bad and Republicans are good. I think the actual picture is more boring than that, which is probably why it doesn't get said very often. Democrats tend to do better on the economy. Republicans tend to do better on national defense and border security. Neither of those facts erases the problems I just spent the last several minutes on. Both parties have real strengths. Both parties have real dysfunction. The strength doesn't cancel the dysfunction, and the dysfunction doesn't cancel the strength. Closing. So that's why I'm not a Democrat. Not because I found something better on the other side. I haven't, and that's a different video. But because I don't think either party has earned the kind of loyalty that gets assumed of people by default. I think you're allowed to see the real strengths of a party clearly and still refuse to belong to it.